So thank you everyone for being here for the Alexandria Library's presentation with Dr. Jodie Jawor on the climate change and effect on plants and animals. Dr. Jawor, thank you very much for coming tonight, and I'm going to let you take it over.
All right, well, thank you very much, Brett, for that lovely introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. I'm going to share my screen. I do have some slides. As mentioned, I am part of the scientific staff at the National Science Foundation. I'm in the biology directorate. I am a behavioral ecologist, a behavioral endocrinologist, and an endocrine physiologist. So I'm interested in how animals behave, why they behave the way they do, what allows them to behave the way they do, and how they respond hormonally to changes in the environment around them with changes in physiology. And I work mostly with birds, so you're going to hear a lot of bird stuff. And most of my work has been with species in their natural environment, so not in captive conditions. And the species I work with the most is the northern cardinal, so something that many people are familiar with. So I'm going to be talking tonight about how plants and animals are responding to, initially it was here a warming climate, and I added changing because we talk more about climate change, although increasing temperatures are a part of that. Let me see. Come on. There we go. All right. So our climate is changing. You know, you look at records from NOAA, NASA, from, many of our international, climatological agencies and organizations. And we're seeing higher and higher temperatures, higher average temperatures, higher summer temperatures, warmer winters. We've also seen an increase in, news reports about very damaging and very extreme weather events. We've had a severe drought and heat wave in the West. The highest ever September temperature anywhere was in Death Valley last week of 127 degrees in September. A massive heat wave in China, one in Australia, we had in the European Union and the United Kingdom. We see bigger and worse storms, Pakistan, historic flooding. We even see things like, instead of heat and rain, we've also seen, in Texas, we've had a winter where massive ice storms and low temperatures took out their power grid. So little tiny bit of energy kind of physics sort of stuff here. What's going on? So we have in the air, we have in organisms, heat energy. When you turn on your burner, either gas or electric, you're going to boil a pot of water for some spaghetti. You're adding heat energy via that burner. That heat energy does transfer between things. It can transfer from the air to bodies of mass. It can transfer from bodies of mass back to the air. We measure the content of heat energy in something via temperature. That's how we read the content. That energy is part of what's driving these insane weather patterns. It can help drive evaporation rates, increase evaporation. It can help change wind patterns. It is the energy that is necessary for these bigger, badder hurricanes that we see. So we do have a naturally occurring layer of gases that hold in heat energy. It's nice insulating, keeps the surface of the planet at a decent temperature. That layer of gases is getting thicker. It's like putting more insulation in your attic. And that big fluffy layer of insulation is better at holding in that heat energy. Then we see an increase in temperature at the surface of the planet. Now we're pretty good at buffering ourselves against these massive changes, be it getting too hot, too cold, too dry. We have some problems. People do succumb to the heat waves. They do succumb to the freezes. But we can get in the house, we can put on clothes, take off clothes, we have HVAC, by and large, we're able to buffer ourselves. Well, what about things that are living outside? Plants, animals, insects, what happens to them? How do they respond to these changes in temperature and increases in temperature? So we do need to think about animals that maintain a constant internal body temperature. We maintain a constant internal body temperature that is different from the outside. We're always about 98 degrees inside our skin. Doesn't matter if it's 110 or 30 degrees, we're always about 98 degrees inside. We have to keep in mind that plants may be more affected by rainfall patterns. They can't get up and go look for water. Water has to come to them, but that temperature can impact how rainfall patterns occur across the environment. So it's a kind of an indirect. So a little bit of data, and yes, this is a little bit out of date, but there's been no major changes where all of a sudden things turn back around. And what you can see is that in areas that are deep red, we've been seeing increases in overall average temperature. In areas that are kind of a pink, it's not so much. Where it's blue, this is indicating there's actually been a decrease in the average temperature. And it doesn't mean it's cold. I used to live in southern Mississippi, and I would describe it as anything other than cold. But this is just indicating that it is a little bit cooler than the average or historic temperatures. And you may be thinking, well, what's 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit? What's a big deal about that? That's not a very big temperature increase, but think about when you had a fever, or your kids or your grandkids had a fever, and how bad you felt. This is sort of like a fever in the environment, and the organisms that live there, live out in it, have to deal with it. What about rainfall patterns? Rainfall patterns are changing too. So areas that are darker green, they've seen more rainfall overall, an increase. Areas that are in this tannish brown, they've seen less. If we brought this up to 2022, the browns and the tans would be much more expansive here in the West, because we have had a historic drought in the western part of the United States. So this becomes problematic, changes in rainfall pattern associated with plants. And there's a lot of worry about changes in rainfall patterns in agriculture, because you may not like to eat vegetables, but the animals that you do like to consume, they are going to be dependent on vegetation. Not enough water for vegetation is a problem. Too much water can also be a problem for vegetation. I spectacularly killed a dahlia this year by putting too much water in the pot and gave it root rot. So changes in rainfall can be very problematic for plants. This can also be very impactful for animals. Everything needs free water, need it to drink. It's very important for physiological processes in your body. And so in an area that has lost rainfall and lost water, perhaps on surface resources because of reduced rainfall or reduced snowfall, this could be problematic once again for the organisms living in the water or near it. So these are some things that we need to keep in mind. So I need to, break and make a kind of a weird transition. But in thinking about the animals, and I am going to talk a little bit more about animals because I am an animal physiologist. When we think about animals, we have to think about it in the environment and responding to what's going on around them. We have to think about those animals that maintain an internal temperature, what we colloquially call warm-blooded organisms or endotherms, like birds. This is a cactus wren that I caught out at one of a southwestern site I was working in. Birds, mammals, ourselves, we're all warm-blooded. And what that means, as I said earlier, is we maintain a constant internal temperature that is different from what's around. If it's cold, if it's hot, doesn't matter. We're always about 98 degrees inside. We have a bunch of physiological processes that make sure we keep ourselves at 98.6 roughly, because that heat energy I mentioned can transfer from air to masses, or a body of mass, or it can go from a body of mass back to the air. That happens. If it's 110, energy, that heat energy that is in the environment at a higher rate is transferring into the animal's body, raising its body temperature by increasing the amount of energy inside of it. That energy has to be gotten rid of. If it's cold, you're going to lose some of your heat energy to this now cold environment that is energy poor itself. You got to be 98.6. We have physiological processes to raise that temperature back up. Ectotherms, cold-blooded things like insects and fish and reptiles and amphibians, they aren't maintaining a body temperature that's radically different from the outside. If it's cold, they're cold. If it's hot, they're hot. There are costs and benefits associated with this. Endotherms, you're always warm. Your muscles are literally always warmed up. Your nerves are firing fast. Chemical reactions that go on in your body, your metabolism, they're cooking along at optimal. Ectotherms, when it's cold, they're not doing so good. You can, if you're okay with it, run and grab a snake when it's cold because it doesn't get away so very well. A cost is caloric. So endotherms, a significant amount of the calories that endotherms like you and I take in during the day is just spent on keeping ourselves at 98.6. We run through a bunch of chemical reactions called cellular metabolism, waste heat from that, it's held inside our system for a little while, keeping us at 98.6. We chew through a ton of calories every day just to maintain 98.6. Ectotherms like this little frog, this little spring peeper, they don't have that sort of cost. So they don't have to worry about foraging nearly as much as endotherms do. But we also get to break into a lot of different environments, and we are a little bit buffered against changes in the environment because we're regulating what's going on inside. So what happens when things are exposed to different temperatures? So this is a very kind of general graph of a small rodent that shows how, in this case, metabolic rate changes, energy expenditure changes in different ambient temperatures. Now, all organisms have what we call a thermoneutral zone, where it's just right, it's perfect. You're neither too hot nor too cold. It's kind of like the Goldilocks deal. You can sit in a t-shirt and light pants, and you are neither shivering nor are you sweating. Perfect. When you go out of that thermoneutral zone, in which you don't have to spend extra energy to either be warm or be cold, cool off or warm up, when you go outside of that thermoneutral zone, you immediately start expending more energy. When it's cold around you, in this case below 26 degrees Celsius, you're losing energy to the environment. The energy is more energy poor. You lose heat. Your body temperature cools down. You start to shiver. You start to have higher metabolic rate to replace that heat and keep yourself at your appropriate temperature that you want to be. You start to burn more calories. Your metabolic rate goes up. We actually on the other end have the same situation. You start to get into a hot environment. You get outside of that thermoneutral zone. Energy from outside is coming in. The body temperature is going up. You got to get rid of that excess energy. So you sweat, or an animal pants. There can be changes in blood flow, changes in behavior that ultimately cost them energy, cost more calories to do these things, to sweat, for example. Now, at the very ends of these lines, these are what we call lethal temperatures. Below a certain temperature, above a certain temperature, it is incompatible with life. Now, oh, Brack, that's a lovely cat. Hello. So you'll notice that high temperatures, that lethal, it happens much faster. What's going on here? So when I mentioned fever, and like you have a little bit of a fever and you don't feel so well, but then you start to worry about your fever getting too high, and when it's like 103 and getting to be like 104, it's time to go to the doctor, maybe the hospital. What's going on there? Temperature in your body, when it gets up really, really high, you can run into a situation where the proteins that are in your body, all that excess energy, all that heat energy that's in the body actually starts to alter the structure of proteins. Think about cooking an egg. Egg yolk is that it's that fluid, clearish albumin. You put egg white into a pan, you apply some heat energy, it turns white, it becomes solid. That is all because of denatured proteins. The shape of the protein is changed. So when you get too high and you're having a really high fever, what you're approaching is protein denaturization. That's what's going to hurt you with too high of a fever. And if too many of your proteins fall apart, that can be lethal. So we can hit lethal high temperatures that kill the individual. Doesn't matter, they can't keep up with the energy coming in. Well, what about something like, and this is a salamander, what about an ectotherm? Well, they too have a tolerance range, body temperatures that they can survive at. They too have lower critical and upper critical temperatures. If they get to these, it's going to be lethal. But they don't worry, or they don't usually measure in metabolism so much, but they look at some other performance measure, like running in a lizard, for example. where across the temperatures that the animal could experience in the environment has an optimal temperature range, where this is where running performance is really good. This is the best. You get lower, running not so good. You get higher, running not so good. And as you get to these upper and lower critical temperatures, again, so much energy is either being lost or so much energy is either being taken on that it's starting to affect physiological processes to the point where it is incompatible with life. So it's all about, here's the individual in the environment. Heat energy around it is being taken on by the organism. It is being lost by the organism. That heat energy is very important in the body. It is facilitating in endotherms, maintaining this very optimal body temperature. It is the energy for chemical reactions like metabolism in both our cold-blooded and our warm-blooded animals. It is part of what's keeping you alive. So now what happens when we get too much heat energy into the environment? Well, worst case, some individuals, they don't make it. Okay, they are going to die from these extreme temperatures. So this is a sad picture. These are not leaves. These are actually budgies or parakeets. Parakeets are native to Australia. They are native to the deep deserts of Australia. In the heat waves that Australia experienced a few years ago, it was so hot and so dry because of all this excess heat energy in the environment that even something that's heavily adapted to survive in deep, deep desert environments succumbed. So those are all birds that have expired. So some things aren't going to survive. Other things, maybe it's not the temperature, it's the resources. So there's intense concern about polar bears. Polar bears are highly adapted to use pack ice. They are cold adapted, and the temperatures are changing fast enough in the environments that they're in that they're not able to adapt and get used to and survive in these temperatures. And there's great concern that we will lose them in the wild. We can have really unexpected mismatches between resources that individuals need because of temperatures, and then we can have adaptation. So let me give you a few examples. So this first example is a classic mismatch, and it was one of the first that was ever really deeply investigated by Jacques Blondel's group over in the European Union. And this is with blue tits on the island of Corsica. And if you're thinking, this looks like a fairly fancy chickadee, you're not far off. The blue tits and the chickadees that we see around here, they are related. Now, adult chickadees across all of their range, and they occur on more than just the island of Corsica, so across all of their species range, they feed their babies these juicy little caterpillars. These are soft and small and easy for a tiny little baby bird beak to crunch up. They're full of water. Everything needs water, and they're full of protein. So they're a nice energy-rich snack, perfect for a baby bird. Baby birds, in case you didn't know, double in size every day. So they need a lot of calories and a lot of proteins. So adult blue tits feed their babies these little tiny green caterpillars. Now, across most of the blue tit species range, we see this nice linking between when the blue tits are laying their eggs and they have babies that have hatched, the leafing out of deciduous trees, and a burst of these little tiny green caterpillars that feed on those new leaves. So when you've got lots and lots of hungry mouths to feed, you've got lots and lots and lots of their food to put in the mouth, and everybody's happy. This falls apart on the island of Corsica. On the island of Corsica, there's more evergreens overall, there's fewer deciduous trees, and there's a wide range in when these trees actually start to leaf out. And so there's a delay for some individual blue tits who start breeding early. They start breeding at a time that it's actually offset from when there's a little bit of a bump of these caterpillars. So these early breeding blue tits on Corsica, the parents are working themselves to the bone. They lose mass, they lose body condition. They're working hard to feed all of their young. And unfortunately, they can't find enough caterpillars that all of their young make it out of the nest. And those that do make it out of the nest, the fledglings are not in the best condition. And as you move from the breeding season into the non-breeding season, the winter, and then back into the next breeding season, so a year, what they see is that for those individuals who had a nest that was mismatched from their caterpillars, those adults had a lower return rate to the population. They didn't survive over the winter. And their fledglings had a lower return rate, a lower survival rate after their first winter. And for those who did make it through the winter from those mismatched nests, they didn't do as well in terms of reproduction in the next year. So multiple generations and stretching across years. You work really hard, you pay for it, you start off on the wrong foot, not getting great food, and you pay for it. And you're thinking, okay, so what does this mean? What's going on? What's the concern? So for many plants, for many animals and insects, day length and temperature are different sorts of cues. So we have a whole bunch of plants, animals, and insects that day length is the cue for them to migrate, to breed, to fruit, to flower, what have you. And day length is day length. It is independent of temperatures. It can be super hot, it can be super cold. Day length is going to change in its little progression that it does as it does. But then we have a whole other cluster of organisms that it's temperature that drives when they're fruiting, when they're flowering, when they're laying eggs, when they're active, when they're moving around. So if you're something like a bird, okay, and you're dependent on, or your breeding cycle is driven by day lengths, and day lengths are getting longer and longer, and you go from a non-breeding to a breeding condition, and you're finally ready to lay your eggs, but you're feeding your babies some sort of insect, like a smooshy little caterpillar that maybe is totally independent of day length, is totally dependent on temperature, and increased temperatures make it flush and appear in the environment days, weeks before you, the adult bird, need it to feed to your babies. That can have a variety of knock-on effects that can decrease population sizes over time. Why do we care? Many, many birds, insects, some of our mammals are pollinators of our food crops. They consume pest insects. They consume weed seeds, things that we want them to do. They do biological services for us. And if we see a diminishing, a decreasing in their population, perhaps due to a mismatch, this can be incredibly damaging to us for some aspects of our agriculture, for example. What about a different example, an adaptable example? What sort of animals are adaptable, could ride this through? So this is some work from my own research with northern cardinals. These are some various pictures I've taken. This is a pair in Florida who was very unhappy with I and my collaborator. And this is somebody, I think she was in Indiana. So I've been working with northern cardinals for quite some time. I've got a collaborator in Wisconsin. I've worked with them in Indiana, Ohio, Maryland, and Mississippi. I have a collaborator in Florida, and I have a collaborator in New York. A lot of people who are very interested in northern cardinals. So this map I'm showing you here is from a very recent Birds of the World species account. I'm an author on it. Yay, it's very cool. And this is showing the range of northern cardinals, the species range, going all the way from Central America up into Canada. Now there's a population, you can sort of see it, there's a population in Los Angeles, there's a population in Hawaii. We took them to LA and Hawaii, but they got all these other places under their own steam. So they marched up, they originated in Central America, and they marched right on up. And there are more reports of them in Canada, and now some reports of them in the Dakotas and even in Montana. How are they able to do this? Well, this is an extremely adaptable species, and many of our extremely adaptable species will have an advantage. So cardinals eat anything. They crunch anything up. They feed their nestlings anything. I have watched them feed their nestlings seeds, fruits, insects, slugs, They chop it up with those strong, strong beaks and turn it into baby food, anything. They nest anywhere. They're okay with disturbed habitat. They're okay with pristine habitat. They don't mind people. They seem able to withstand a wide variety of temperatures. Very, very cold and very, very dry seems to be their kryptonite, is what I'm calling it here. You don't see them in deep desert. You don't see them in super, super cold areas. That seems to be tough for them. It is that generalizable aspect that they can exist in anything, use anything, that gives them an advantage. They don't have any specialization. I and my collaborators, we have been looking at endocrine flexibility. We've been looking at a particular class of hormones called the glucocorticoids, corticosterone, stress hormones is what you probably have heard them called. That's an energy using hormone. We've been looking at this across their different temperature regimes. We recently were looking at aspects of structural size. Birds up in the north, they're bigger than birds in the south. This is just within cardinals. They're behaviorally different. Their coloration is a little different. They're very, very flexible and very, very adaptable. And so we do have species like this who will survive any sort of big changes. Now, people like cardinals, probably everyone's like, I can get behind having more cardinals, 2 thumbs up. What about things that we don't like? Ugh, mosquitoes, ticks, biting flies, horrible things that just drive us nuts. They bite you, you don't feel good, and even more scary and damaging, they transmit parasites, viruses, bacteria, plasmodia. Some of these diseases are already here, some we don't want here, and these are not things you want to get. So what happens with this? So let's take a mosquito, for example, and in case you aren't familiar with how these things happen. A mosquito bites somebody who has malaria. Malaria is a bloodborne disease. It's in a parasite in the blood. So that malaria goes from the infected person into the mosquito that just took a blood meal. And it doesn't give the mosquito malaria. The malarial parasite gets in the mosquito's little salivary glands. Then a mosquito comes and it bites somebody else. Now, when a mosquito bites you, it injects a little bit of its saliva into your skin. This has got an anticoagulant, so it can get a blood meal. But when it injects that saliva, that malaria parasite goes into you as well. And so now someone else has picked up this disease. This is the same thing that happens with like Lyme's disease, with ticks, for example. Little bit of this in the salivary glands ends up in you. Mom insects can also give their babies the diseases, just transfer it over to them in the eggs. Now, we know that temperature impacts adult survival. Okay, low temperatures, high temperatures can be negatively impact to adult survival. It impacts the viability and the hatching of eggs, larval survival. Many of these have aquatic larvae, and also offspring maturation. So you're like, okay, low and high temperatures, this could kill them. Well, we run into an issue with something like a mosquito. These guys are explosive breeders. A female lays tons and tons and tons of eggs. The eggs can enter diapause, a state of suspended animation, to make it through tough temperatures, is how they overwinter, eggs in diapause. That explosive breeding, you've got tons and tons and tons of individuals. Female mosquitoes, for example, they do not mate with just one male. They mate with more than one male, and they have genetically very diverse offspring. Some of those offspring, just through luck, can have the genetics to survive in not so great conditions. So lots and lots of babies, some of them are going to make it even in a bad environment. And once they have a toehold, then boom, they're off. So these are 2 maps that are not showing density. These are 2 maps that are showing the potential good climate for 2 particular species of mosquito, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. These 2 particular mosquitoes can transmit dengue, yellow fever, Zika, chikungunya, diseases that we don't want. The darker the color, this is showing environments that are better for these particular mosquitoes. And they like it warm and they like it humid. Now, a couple of things to think about. This is from 2017. Think back to that map, those maps I had that showed temperatures were getting warmer up along the northern parts of the US, and there was a little bit more rainfall in certain areas. That's warm and wet. That's perfect environment. So this environment of potentially good breeding zones for these particular mosquitoes could increase, it could expand. In the unlikely, this lighter green or this lighter blue, the unlikely area, that doesn't mean it's impossible, it just means it's less likely that they would breed here. But think about what I just said. A female mosquito breeds explosively. She mates with more than one male. It just takes a couple of individuals who just through the genetic luck of the draw can really make it in this not so good area. If they can do it and they can find somebody to have babies with, then you've got mosquitoes that are established and pushing their line ever forward. So this is what we're very concerned about with species that we're not so thrilled about, having these species move in. Now, this is mosquitoes. We've also got a lot of concerns with ticks, particularly ticks that are coming back, and I hate to say it, on migrating songbirds. There are many stations along the Gulf Coast that are monitoring birds that are crossing the Gulf Coast on their migrational, seasonal migrational movements, looking to see if they're bringing any sorts of ticks from South America back up here with them. And will those ticks find an environment that they can breed in and take off? That is always a concern. All right, so I've been talking a lot about animals, giving you some examples. What about plants? Okay, so remember, plants need water, right? We have all spectacularly, had a potted plant that we forgot about, or it's hasn't rained in a while. The potted plant dies, our yards look crummy. I told you I overwatered a plant, can do that just as readily. So plants need water. Plants need their pollinators. Some plants pollinate by wind, but some are dependent on insects or birds or mammals that may be impacted by temperatures. But plants, they're going to have some impacts of both water and temperature themselves. And this is just a compilation of data that I pulled actually out of some NPR work, articles. It's looking at plants that we care about and how could these be impacted. So wheat, I always used to hear about winter wheat where I was growing up. We did have some nice flat area in Indiana and Ohio, so you had a lot of agriculture there. But wheat is a species that actually does not like high temperatures. It doesn't do particularly well in high temperatures. And as we have increases in temperature in the environment, it's predicted that this will be negatively impacted. And wheat is an important crop in the US. Peaches. People love their peach cobbler, right? That's pretty good. Well, it turns out that peaches actually need a certain amount of cold temperature outside of the flowering season in order to prime the flowers to flower. So they need to see a certain level of low temperature for a certain amount of time to get those flowers ready to actually bloom in the spring. That's something I didn't know. If you don't have flowering peaches, you don't have peaches. And peaches are, again, a very important crop. Coffee. I love coffee. Many of you love coffee. If I don't get my coffee, I am not a happy person. Coffee is it wants it cool, but not cold, not too hot, likes high humidity. It's very picky about its temperatures. If we see changes in rainfall patterns, if we see changes in temperature, this could negatively impact coffee crops. Corn is very, very water hungry, needs lots of water. Changes in precipitation pattern could knock back corn crops. Almonds are very much the same way, need a lot of water. Change in precipitation pattern, it's a change for those farmers that are growing that crop. It's going to be reduced. Now, we're very dependent. Corn is soybeans are incredibly important, wheat, incredibly important crops. This makes up a lot of our agriculture. for many people that have invested in peach trees, peach orchards, or almond orchards. If they see changes in temperatures or changes in rainfall, this could be economically devastating to certain areas in the country because they are very heavily invested in these particular crops. It's not very easy to just get up and grow a bunch of new peach trees somewhere or grow a bunch of new almond trees somewhere. That's a long-term investment. So there is a lot of concern about temperatures and water pattern in addition to the animals that are part of the pollination for some of these species, the organisms that are pests of these species that also are being impacted by changes in the environment. So a lot of layering sort of effects that one has to keep in mind as one is kind of going through, okay, what could happen as we have temperatures change and the climate change through time. All right, so I wanted to leave time for questions if folks had questions. I'm just going to summarize that we've got climate change. It is changing. It is not the climate that we used to know when many of us were little kids. And I don't think it's just the, the rosy glasses of youth. My brother still lives near the area where we grew up, and he likes to argue with me because I'm his baby sister. And we're talking about this. And I said, you remember when we were little kids at Halloween, we always had to be able to incorporate winter clothes or even worst case scenario, our snowsuits. And I mean, that ruined many a fantastic Halloween costume. But I was like, did you ever have to do that for your son? And he was just like, no, I never did. So it's changing. It is not what it was. I don't want to get in an argument about why it's changing, like what's causing it, it's changing. Now, for those species that have good buffering skills, and we got things that have good buffering skills, it may be a tough transition to adapt to changing, but it's doable. They can do it. Not all organisms are going to be things that we want that are adaptable, right? Those mosquitoes, those insects, those weeds that we don't, those negatively impactful things that we don't want. Some of those are going to make it through the changes as well. And there's great concern and interest from the scientific community about these mismatches and what happens where you've got temperatures driving one thing, day lengths changing, driving something else. The two must interact in some way as a predator prey or a pollinator and a plant that it pollinates. And when that mismatch occurs, what does that mean? How is something else going to pick up the dropped out space? Is a different resource going to be used? Is a different pollinator going to come in? We don't know. And there's a lot of research in the area of science that I work in a lot of area of that like integrative ecological physiologists work in, trying to get a better handle on what will happen with some of these mismatches. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. And hopefully we have some questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Nope, that's a new share. Stop sharing that. And Brock, I think did you want to try and handle the questions? Read them
Yes,
out
I have.
or something?
Yes, I have one question from Ashley, and it's got a couple of questions built into it.
Okay.
As people, as people find strategies for adapting to the need as temperatures rise or whatever, in order to get through those extremes, I guess there's two parts to this question. Do animals or plants even find alternative places to find water? I mean, are they most animals are not locked into an area, they're migratory. Do they find ways of exploring to find more resources that can that they can adapt in that way? Yeah.
So something that it's been a while since I've done some presentations, so I got a little excited and I skipped over something I meant to mention, and this sort of gets at Ashley's question, which is a great question, Ashley. Something that animals can do on those, when I showed you that graph that had the flat part and then the two ends that went up, they can do little cheats of exactly kind of what you're asking about here. heats in that, you can change your activity patterns. If it's really hot, then you try to not be so active at the hot part of the day. You can find little microclimates that maybe are holding, heat around you a little bit better, keep you a little warmer if it's cold, keep you a little cooler. And some animals do move. Not everything is as mobile as you might think. So we do have some very large migratory organisms. You think of like the big well-known migrations of like reindeer up in the Arctic. They're moving around, avoiding certain areas, moving toward new food. Or you think about like the big antelope migrations in Africa. Again, they're moving to different areas, moving toward the rainy areas during the monsoon. So yes, there is some organisms can definitely do that. They can move to different areas to find resources that they need. But unfortunately, not everything can do that. So I see we have a cardinal question. I'll hearken to my cardinals. So the cardinals that I study, they're not migratory. They don't go anywhere, and they don't even really get in these big flocks that move around. They're territorial, and they stay on their territory year round. Neighbors don't want the neighbors coming over. So it's kind of like you wouldn't want, well, I don't know how well you know your neighbors, but let's say you have neighbors that you don't really know very well, maybe you don't like. You don't want them just coming in, you wake up one morning, they're drinking, the milk out of your fridge. Cardinals don't want someone coming over and using their resources on their territory. So they can't actually do as much moving around. So yes and no. There are going to be some ways that organisms can avoid the worst of it, some ways that some species they just can't, because behaviorally they're territorial, they don't move around. If it's not on their territory, they're not going to be able to get at it. Let's see, will any other animal species adapt and conserve water in their bodies to help them survive? Possibly, we don't know. Sometimes our conditions are changing so fast, I don't know that certain individuals, organisms can go through the adaptive changes to be able to retain enough water. That genetic variation I talked about in mosquitoes and bugs that could make you a little bit better to survive in a nasty habitat, that is the stuff of adaptation, that genetic variation. So in many cases, we're running the experiment right now to see how fast can animals adapt. So that's a possibility, it really is. But I just don't know the answer to it. So I hope that helped. Ruby is asking, Brack, did you want to read out the questions, or do you want me to just jump?
Okay, I'll read it out just so my picture's here and I can be on, have an audio too. Is there anything special one can do to get cardinals to come into their backyard birdhouse?
Yes, everybody likes cardinals. So what I have found works pretty well is, if you have a bird feeder, and I assume you meant bird feeder, they do not nest in bird houses. So they're not like wrens or chickadees that would use a birdhouse. Feeders that have a little bit more physical space. So platform feeders, or, even seed on the ground. They do like the black oil sunflower seed. I've seen that as something that they really enjoy, or the whole sunflower seed. The black oil sunflower seed that's still got the holes on it is a little cheaper, but it is a little messier. And a water resource. So I've got a variety of feeders in my backyard, and right now I'm watching one on a platform feeder over here, and I can't quite see it, but I've got cardinals over at my bird bath. So getting a water resource for them and offering them, seeds, black oil, sunflower seeds on something that's got a little bit more physical space for them to land and move around on seems to be what does best.
And Atticus asked if you could discuss some of the ways people can support animals and even plants through climate change.
Mm-hmm. So there are a variety of things you can do. A lot of people have been recently, I've seen a lot of this on different social media, but I've done a little looking into this as well. A lot of people are planting in parts of their yard native plants. Okay, native prairie plants, just taking a little patch out of their yard, getting rid of the cultivated grass and putting natural wildflowers in, making sure that native trees are planted. Native trees, native plants, they're adapted, of course, to the light cycles here. Our temperature cycles are not so horrifically out of whack that, oh my goodness, these native plants can't do well here anymore. But bringing more of those native species in, making sure that, you are retaining tree cover. I know people don't necessarily want to have a lot of trees around their house, but having the trees around the house, having the native plants, that's going to be great for the native bird species. These are going to be great for moisture retention in the soil in many cases, and providing shade. So you've got food, you've got shade, you've got water resources. These are the things that you can be doing to help support animals, plants, and this can even be supportive to you, getting some of these native species in and shade cover that can help keep your house cooler even.
Is there anything we can get local governments to encourage them to do to help, to help people, change their landscape in their yards, or volunteering to help in those changes?
Yes, so I know there's a variety of conservancy groups. So like the Nature Conservancy, they do have a lot of resources for like, what are the appropriate species in your area for plants that you might want to plant. And some of them even do sell like seed mixes that you can get. And I know some of the good local, what I want to say, garden stores, the good local, like, not like the Lowe's, not knocking on Lowe's, but like some of the local places, they actually have people who are really, really knowledgeable. And I know you can get your yard certified as if you've got enough natural habitat in it, as a wildlife sanctuary. And one of my neighbors actually has a sign where they have done this. And I think they did it through the Nature Conservancy. So that's kind of like a national organization. Now, in terms of local governments, so I don't live over in Virginia, so I don't know who to tell you to go to, but definitely every state in the country has it was the Department of Natural Resources where I grew up. It is some sort of natural resources state agency. It might be a fish and wildlife agency, a state agency, but every single state has one of these that in many cases can give you guidance on, here are some things that you can do to help wildlife survive, to help wild plants survive. And in terms of volunteering, oh boy, I bet there's all sorts of agencies, state agencies, local agencies, or groups like the, oh gosh, what am I thinking? My brain just froze up. I apologize, everyone.
Well, I wanted to add, when you mentioned about, there's a local park here in Alexandria, not a park, but it's it's in this part of, near the Duncan Branch Library off of Beverly. It's Monticello Park, and it's been declared a refuge in an old growth forest because of the care. And so there are ways, I think, that you can actually have those spots declared a sanctuary in a way.
Yes. And, many years ago, I used to work at, it's called Allwood Audubon Center. This is where I did the research for my PhD. And, it was owned by the Audubon Society. It was an old farm, and they ran a wide variety of volunteer events to, do something at Allwood, or they ran a variety of different classes to help people with, what could you do in your yard? And I apologize, my cat's yodeling at the door, if you can hear her. There is no good side to a closed door for a cat. So I'm not saying go to Ohio, to Allwood Audubon Center, but I know that we do have places around here that I'm sure they would love volunteers. I'm sure that they also run probably some different programs of, here's things you could do at the center, here's things that you could do at home. So I'm sorry that I don't have anything specific, but those would be some suggestions of places to start.
I have a question from Ruby. She's asking, how are earthworms affected by climate change?
Okay, so earthworms. So temperature can increase in the soil as well. So that heat energy that's in the air that we can absorb, it gets into the soil, gets into the water as well. And earthworms, they can dig a little deeper, okay, into the soil in order to get to a more pleasant temperature environment. But you start to get down too low and you could run into some aeration issues for them. So they do need oxygen as well. So earthworms are negatively impacted by climate change as well, unfortunately. And they are very important, as people know. They are a big part of soil health.
Well, how about addressing issues like as we get more mosquitoes, of course, people want to use more pesticides. How is this circle of reaction to that? How does that act to the detriment of the natural species in an area? Right.
So, I can give you not a mosquito example, but an example that just made me sad. We had ants in the house and we decided to spray around the house, and we had a company spray around the house, and it killed all the darn spiders. And we got a horrible infestation of bagworms that destroyed one of our trees outside our house, just got on it, stripped it all down, dead. So as you see more mosquitoes and you're starting to feel driven to use more in the way of pesticides, because pesticides are many of them are very broad spectrum and they're indiscriminate. This is going to potentially kill not just the mosquitoes, but beneficial insects that you might want. And then if you've got species that are dependent on those insects for consumption, it could negatively impact them. So what do you do? Well, you do need to be careful with standing water, right? So everybody knows you don't want standing water and tires and things like that if they're on your property. So you gotta be careful about that. If you've got a nice, healthy sort of environment in the yard, you got a lot of nice native plants, for example, or like me, I don't have a bunch of native prairie in my backyard, but I don't do anything to maintain special sort of grass. I just kind of let anything that's back there grow. It doesn't really matter. You do get a nice diversity of different sorts of insects that create these food webs that are consuming. And spiders, I know people hate spiders. Spiders are a huge predator on all sorts of things that we don't want. There's all sorts of birds. If you've got the cover, if you've got bushes, if you've got trees in your yard, you can attract all sorts of insectivorous birds that could be consuming things out of your yard. So leaning away from the pesticides, I know it's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to deal with these mosquitoes, but leaning away from the pesticides, trying to let, everything else that's out there, all the predatory insects, the predatory mammals, the predatory birds that are eating insects do their thing, it can actually start to have a difference. Bats are a huge one. And I know people don't like bats. I had a coworker who he was here in Alexandria working at the building, but his house was in Michigan. And all of a sudden his cameras went off one night in the house, that there was something moving in his house, and it was a bat flying around. And he came to my office and he was like, I'm gonna burn my house down, bats. And I was like, no. It got in your attic and it got loose. Don't worry. Bats eat mosquitoes. And he's like, what? And I was like, bats eat mosquitoes. And so he went and he looked and he's like, do you know how many mosquitoes a bat can eat? So he now has 10 bat houses on his property because he hates mosquitoes so much. He went from, I don't like bats, I'm terrified of them, to I love bats because they eat mosquitoes. And so you could do something like, all right, I've got great habitat that I'm not using insecticides. I'm promoting all these insects that eat them. I'm going to promote bats too. Let me put a bat house out. That would be a fantastic thing as well. And yes, someone said providing water resources attracts mosquitoes. You do have to be very careful with those water resources. I do actually clean my bird feeder, my bird bath every other day. I go in and I give it a scrub, and I'm changing the water quite frequently. And that is what you're going to have to do for like a bird bath, for example. that could be attracting mosquitoes. That's a very good point.
Jenny has posted on here, Northern Virginia, about the Virginia Earth sells local ecotype native plants. She also commented or informed us that the National Wildlife Federation will certify your yard as a wildlife
That's
habitat.
it, National Wildlife Federation.
And the Northern Virginia Audubon at home through Fairfax Master Naturalist will visit your yard and advise you as how to accomplish a wildlife habitat. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Very good information. And I think that might be who the National Wildlife Federation, that sounds very familiar for who the sign up in my neighbor's yard. So yep, they do come to your yard and they do certify that. And I have to say, my neighbor has an absolutely fantastic yard. And I think I've even seen a fox in it, which made me very, very happy.
We have fox in Delray. Just to let you know, there's a den around. I see the fox every once in a while in the late evening. I was let's see, Ashley has also asked about some other strategies and how animals might adapt. Can animals do anything beyond just shedding their hair or even losing the layers of fat in their skin to help address when it gets too hot?
Yeah.
Is there anything like that they do?
Oh yeah. So, feathers can be lost on birds, hair can be lost from animals, to just create areas where heat energy can evaporate off of the individual, sweating, of course. But there's also an interesting amount of work that's been done on the postural adjustments that organisms will make. Literally just kind of like sitting somewhere with your limbs out so that air can just kind of go by you and make your heat go away and whisk it off of your body. A lot of our flying organisms will actually start to fly, because if you're moving, wings are out. And so again, you can lose heat, you go up into a cooler environment. But again, the problem with many of these is it still requires the expenditure of energy to do. So flying is not an energy-free thing to do. So you're losing heat at the same time your muscle contractions, for example, are still generating heat. So it's a very, very fine balancing act between doing something to get rid of heat that might, in fact, make you generate heat at the same time. And so it becomes pretty tricky really fast. And that's why that curve I showed, that the lower, it truncated much faster at the higher temperatures than the cold temperatures. It is really hard to lose enough heat without generating extra heat in order to lose that. You get to a point where your temperatures are too high and you're getting to a lethal.
All right. Well, are there any more questions for this evening?
Ginny's telling us the Asian tiger mosquito. Those are a nasty one. Their bite hurts.
We do have one more. Okay. Yes. All right. Yep. Yes. Well, also, fire ants have been moving up from the south. They've been coming up more and more. Have they established themselves up in this area? And that's temperature affected, isn't it?
Some of it is temperature. Some of it is they like particular sorts of disturbed soils. And I haven't heard that any are here. I have dealt with fire ants on my when I was in Mississippi. They are not enjoyable. They are not. They are terrible. But I don't know how far north they've made it at this point.
And Ashley commented that we have the Nature Conservancy in Virginia as well, and she said they're a good place for volunteering too. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
Well, if we have no more questions, and I'm sure we always have questions, Jenny has told us fire ants have been on Long Island for decades, I'm afraid. Oh, that's sad.
Yeah, I haven't seen any in my yard, so they may. The fire ants are another thing that has been moved around, unfortunately. Many of our pest species get accidentally shuffled around through trucking, through, resource movies, soil, you name it. Yeah, they are a very unpleasant one. They're very unpleasant. I have accidentally stood in a fire ant nest, and yeah, they crawled all the way up to my hips and then just went to town, and not enjoyable. Don't do it.
And Jenny wants me to make sure you understand that mosquito spray does not kill the mosquito eggs, only the adults. So spraying is ineffective for mosquitoes, but devastating to all our useful insects. And thank you, Jenny. I agree completely.
Yes, thank you.
So anyway, if we're going to shut down, we're going to have this program has been recorded, and we will have it on the library's YouTube channel. And I want to thank Dr. Jawor for coming this evening and giving this presentation. It's been very informative. And thank you everyone who has come to watch and submit their questions and make their comments. And look for more programming on the Alexandria Library's website. And thank you again for coming.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. All right, and thank you, Breck, for the lovely invite.
Okay, thank you.
All right, have a good evening.
All right.
Bye-bye.
You too.